it is my pleasure to welcome Ivana Bartoletti. She is a director at Deloitte and a visiting policy fellow at the University of Oxford. And really, this is just such a wonderful topic to round out the stage, I think, because I think this gets to the heart of this issue in ethics about who gets to decide what and what does good even mean. So a lot to cover in 40 minutes. And yeah, very much. Oh, I think you might have a bit more. Anyway, a lot to cover, and looking forward to hearing more.
Thank you so much, Alice, and I share your enthusiasm. Really, I mean, after this sort of year of pandemic, I think is great for those of us, and those of you who will be able to meet in person, but also those who here at COGEX, and also to have so many conversations over the last few days has been really, really interesting and really comforting to have so many people engaged in this discussion. It's my absolute pleasure to take part in this panel, to moderate this panel, which, as Alice was saying, is really much at the heart of the entire issue, because we are asking what does good look like and who defines what good is. But before I start and introduce the topic, I'm really proud to introduce some amazing speakers who will be trying to dig into this topic with me. So let me start with Melissa McSherry, who is Senior Vice President, Global Head of Data Security and Identity Products at Visa. Ziad Obermeyer, with Blue Cross of California, Distinguished Associate Professor. Ashley Ainsley, co-founder of Coloring Tech, and Mark Darkey, who is Head of Tech Assurance and Good Practice at the Center for Data Ethics and Innovation. Welcome, everyone. It's really great to be surrounded by such amazing people, and we'll try and have very much of a conversation, and do encourage the audience to really share some thoughts and questions, because what I would very much like to do is to have some of the questions coming and trying to pick up as many comments coming from the public. Now, for the last 3 days here at COGEX, we've been discussing and talking about the future, about new technology, and when it comes to artificial intelligence ethics, we've been talking about how to make sure that AI works for everybody. And now we go to the real question here, and I want to start with this very, very simple question for you all, just to kick off the discussion. And I want to ask you, what is a good outcome for you? When you say, because a lot of the discussions that we're having over the last few months, and I'll start with you, Melissa, no pressure, but a lot of the discussions that we've been having over the last few months and few years around artificial intelligence has been, yes, AI as a system where there are so many and there's so much potential for good, but also, who decides what we're going to use AI for, and in particular, what decides what a good outcome is. And sometimes we've had a lot of discussions around, is the definition of good too neutral? Mm-hmm. And where is the good, defined? Who is involved in this discussion? Who defines what's good, and good for whom? And I think this really goes at the heart of the problem. So before we dig any further, I just want to ask every single one of you, when you think about a good outcome, what does it mean to you? Melissa, can I ask you first?
It's such a great question, and I think such at the core of what we need to be thinking about in the context of responsible use of AI. So I think a lot of times people focus on good through the lens of technique, like, how did you select the data, or accuracy of the model, or compliance. But I think it's quite challenging in some cases to define a good outcome, because we need to look at the outcome of the use of the model, and the people that the models are being applied to, they themselves may not agree on what is a good outcome. So as an example, in the context of what I do, Visa scores all of the transactions that go across the Visa network, across all 3.5 billion cards that we have issued in real time for whether or not we think that they're fraudulent transactions. And from a certain point of view, you could look at that and say, well, good is having no fraud, right? Because that it's good for consumers, because they don't have to deal with the anxiety of seeing an unrecognized transaction or calling their bank. It's good for the banks because they don't lose the money from the fraud. And it's actually good for society, because fraudsters who commit fraud actually often turn around and use that for other criminal activities, whether it's drug smuggling or organized crime or terrorist financing. The list sort of goes on and on. the thing is, if we focus just on the fraud prevention part of using AI and models for when we look at fraud, we might end up in a situation where any transaction that looks out of the ordinary gets blocked, and that actually would be incredibly inconvenient for consumers. It also would be costly for the banks, because then they'd have the consumers calling them saying, "Why did my transactions get blocked?" And it's might push people towards using more cash, which on balance is actually not as good for society. And so complicating this even further is that individual consumers and individual banks and individual merchants themselves might have a different view of the relative importance of convenience and security. So this is, I think that it is a very difficult question as to what is good. And I think it's important in answering that question, first of all, we approach it with a lot of humility, but also we bring in the perspective of the individuals and companies that are actually being impacted by the systems that these AI models are a part of.
Thank you, and that's really interesting. I mean, the fraud example that you gave is really spot on, and I want to ask now Mark to come in, if that's okay. And I wanted to add a little bit to the question, because as Melissa was talking, yes, I mean, it's really interesting. So good, it depends, on who we're talking about, but the question that I wanted to ask you as a Center for Data Ethics is really around sort of, if you think that there is if there is something that what does AI changes with all this? I mean, in reality, any technology was facing the same issue. The adoption of new technology, you say, well, who are we adopting it to? What does it mean for the common good? What does it mean for society? What is good for? What is the difference now? Would you be able to add that into this conversation?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And part of me says it's not different to other technologies. There are, as all technologies and indeed other kinds of changes happen, there's always risk that people are affected in adverse ways, in ways that weren't expected. I think AI is interesting in a couple of ways. Partly that the kind of levels of automation that can happen are greater possibly than we might have had before. So when we're making decisions and humans are making them, the speed at which decisions are made is kind of inherently constrained by the number of humans making decisions. There is opportunity for review of decisions and processes to change, even if they're quite heavily sort of processing and automated. There's perhaps more opportunity for change. When you look at the 3.5 billion Visa transactions, 3.5 billion Visa cards, all their transactions, that's a level of sort of intelligent decision making, very, very fast, where if something goes wrong, a lot of decisions are made very, very quickly, and a lot of people are potentially impacted very, very quickly before you've really had a chance to work out what's going wrong. I think that speed is a really interesting point. I think market size is also possibly interesting. So we've looked at CDI quite a lot at recruitment as an example. I think it's quite an interesting example of a kind of area where AI tools are starting to emerge. It's also an area where there have been a lot of historical and sadly current issues around bias and discrimination, for example, in recruitment. It's not a non-problem if humans are recruiting. Humans are biased too. But we have developed over the years quite a lot of coping mechanisms for that. There is good practice around training interviewers to think about their own biases. There is training and kind of processing, having an objective set of criteria, scoring people against it in a neutral way, maybe getting different interviewers to score people independently and then discussing the scores. All these things are intended to address some of the harms and some of the kind of bad practice that can exist in human recruiting. We perhaps haven't caught up with some of this in AI. We're almost having, it feels at times, a separate conversation about fairness in AI, which talks in terms of metrics and talks in terms of sort of mathematical fairness definitions, all of which are highly relevant, lots of really good research, but probably should be a bit less disconnected from some of the previous conversations that have gone on. I think the other thing then coming to the market size point is increasingly we're seeing consolidation into sort of smaller numbers of tools in a number of areas. And Visa is an example that hadn't occurred to me, actually. Visa process huge numbers of transactions across lots of different banks, across lots of countries. There are competitors, but I think Visa are by some margin the biggest. You can say similar things like Google, Facebook, some of the big social media platforms. And you could easily see in an area like recruitment, we haven't yet, but you could easily see really dominant platforms starting to emerge. And if you apply for a job and you are discriminated against by an individual employer, or someone just doesn't like your face, they get upset the mark doesn't want a tie when he walks into the room. That's annoying if you're applying for one job. It's only so annoying though because there are probably some other companies you can apply to. If every company you walk into is using the same recruitment platform to assess your application and you get rejected for exactly the same spurious reason, be that just discriminatory or just some other spurious reason, that's more than annoying. That's really problematic for your life. So I think that market size thing about how decisions can be replicated in lots of places is another really interesting change in the dynamic.
Mark, this is really interesting. I mean, the discussion around market size, it's a really interesting one because obviously it's a discussion that we're having across so many sectors at the moment. So it's really timely and ties in, with the issue around discrimination that you were saying. So I wanted to ask Ziad now, if that's okay. I'm interested in your view when defining what is good. I mean, you've come from a particular perspective, which is more medical. And I was interested in your approach to this. What is a good outcome from your side? Thanks.
Yeah, let me distinguish between the way that humans can make these kinds of judgments and the way that algorithms do. So, when we talk about things like fraud, like a transaction is fraudulent, when we as humans are kind of talking about what fraud is, we have some understanding at an abstract level of fraud, but we can't actually write down in rules what fraud represents. We can't say if the transaction amount is greater than this and the location is greater than so many kilometers from someone's home. Like there's no rule set that is going to help us do that. And that's a big problem when you're dealing with 3 billion transactions a year, because we just can't, humans can't process that volume of data. So we see that in finance, we see that in health a lot. So one example that we've studied is health systems know that some of their patients are going to get sick, say over the next year, and they want to help them now to prevent their flare-ups of chronic illnesses. But who do you help? So as a human, we can have some model of like, okay, this person looks like they're going to get sick. Now, when you're dealing with millions of patients, you can't do that with humans. And so you need to rely on algorithms or at least some sort of rules in data. And that's where a lot of problems start, because we don't have a set of rules that defines fraud, and we don't have a set of rules that defines who's going to get sick. So let me tell you one example from my research that we studied where this went horribly wrong. So there's a lot of software that is used by hospitals and health systems around the world that's meant to find people who are going to get sick. The way all of those software packages define going to get sick is going to cost the healthcare system a lot of money. Now, that's not actually an unreasonable thing to do, because in general, when people get sick, they go to the hospital, they generate costs. The problem is that in the US, but also in lots of other places, not everybody who needs healthcare gets healthcare. And so not everyone has their costs recorded when they get sick. And that means that when that algorithm is defining health needs with respect to dollars, it's going to miss certain people. In the US, it's going to miss people of color, Black patients predominantly, and that's what we found. We found an enormous amount of racial bias that was introduced by these algorithms. In other parts of the world, anyone who has less access to the healthcare system is going to be discriminated against by these kinds of algorithms. And so that core question of defining what is good is really a critical one for when we're training algorithms, because algorithms are very literal. We can't tell them, find someone who's going to get sick. We need to write down a certain set of criteria that the algorithm can learn from and automate. That can be very powerful. We want the healthcare system to anticipate someone's health needs and find people before they get sick. But it can also be very dangerous when we're making these abstract judgments in very dry, technical ways. So what we found is that when we're translating abstract concepts like fraud or health, or in finance, creditworthiness, in criminal justice, it's criminality, into concrete things like income, number of arrests or convictions, number of dollars spent on healthcare, algorithms can learn all of the structural inequalities and biases in our society, and not only reproduce them, but scale them up. So the last thing I wanted to add is that we can actually do better. So in all of the work that we've done with health systems, with insurance companies, with tech companies, with regulators in the US, we've actually found that even though algorithmic bias is everywhere and it's often driven by these kinds of issues, we have different variables in our data sets that let us work around that bias. So in a lot of our work, we've actually found that these biased algorithms can be improved and made to fight inequality rather than to perpetuate it by retraining them to learn better outcomes. And so really your question was such an inspired one to start this discussion, because what counts as a good outcome is really a manifestation of our value system, of our ethics, of what we want algorithms to do. And that choice is incredibly important, but we often make it as a small seeming technical decision and as an afterthought. And so realigning algorithms to that strategic goal is not just good for the general enterprise of having algorithms do what we want them to do, it's also very good for equity.
Thank you so much. And you made two important points. I mean, the point around sort of data classification and sort of the wider politics of data classification in relation to sort of equitable outcomes, I think now has become mainstream, and it's a really important thing that has become mainstream. And also you make the point around sort of the fact that to want something that is a good outcome when it comes to automated decision making and machine learning, there has to be a sort of an active decision to wanting it to play that role. Because if you don't manipulate or repurpose, as you were saying, then if you leave it to the existing data, then you end up running the risk of hardwiring existing inequality into the machines. This leads me beautifully to the amazing work that Ashley is doing with coloring tech, and I do wonder if you could talk through sort of what it means for you to say good outcome. And in particular, there's one question within this that I wanted to ask you. Sometimes when we talk about good and good for whom and the risk within the algorithmic bias and all of that, I think, it's, for me, there's always the sort of the fact that we run the risk of having a very neutral depiction of what is good, and not really rooted into reality, but in particular, something that has been the sort of construct of years and years of the society as as it is now. And sometimes I feel when we say neutral, that the risk of something being neutral, which is not neutral, is actually simply the mirror of what society looks like in 2021. So I wanted to ask you what it means for you, when you say good outcome. How do you see this, and how do we make sure that it that there is a more inclusive definition of good outcome?
Yeah, replicating today, and this concept of neutral doesn't necessarily, to exactly the point that you highlighted, mean that we're fine. I think when I think about kind of this topic, there's a lot of focus on the outcome. But really, any outcome is the result of the processes that go into it. And I think there's not a lot of progression in the conversation beyond thinking about, well, we know that some of the data sets that we're working with, or some of the predisposed information that we are evaluating on what is good and bad might be subject to bias. I think most people understand that as a concept, but how are we actually going about including more reflection on that process, and actually ultimately changing that? And that really comes down to, if we want outcomes to be more inclusive, so to speak, and make sure that we're including everybody, then we have to go backwards a step, basically, and think about, well, where are the inputs coming from, and how inclusive are those? How many people are able to input into our data sets, for example? How is that data collected? Much to lots of people who've ever studied any of the social sciences, data collection in itself isn't this bias-free laden kind of thing, and this pandemic has kind of forced us to have trust in science and the renewal of this kind of science as this kind of objective fact. But even if we look at even like COVID deaths, for example, there are different ways of counting stuff and different ways of counting death and fatality. And actually, the way that we think about that influences the types of outcomes and decisions that we are very much making on a flying, policy making decision. So, from our perspective, it's thinking about, well, how do we include more minority voices, more people from underrepresented backgrounds into the processes that produce some of the outcomes that we're trying to have? And then there's a conversation about what those are. And, for me, it's kind of like, well, how do we reduce the ability for systems to exacerbate undesirable outcomes? And what that undesirable is, well, we've kind of had a lot of public discussion about those things, and there's examples now. We've spoken about fraud, for example, spoken about credit risk, spoken about discrimination in the workplace. I think there are a number of outcomes which we would generally regard as undesirable, but it's actually like, well, how do we actually bake people into those processes? How much investment and effort are we putting into connecting with people who aren't at all in our ecosystem, aren't people that we employ, aren't people who typically engage in credit rating systems or typically unbanked, for example? And how do we make sure that their needs and their uses are built in? Because otherwise we end up just reinforcing the status quo of a system which we already know is challenged and in many instances producing suboptimal outcomes. And as we've spoken, the danger is that we just reinforce what that looks like at the expense of other people. So, what is good? I think that's quite a really hard discussion to say, but I think we can probably start from the output of saying there are lots of predictable outcomes which we can say are bad.
Yes.
And how do we work backwards from that to improve our process and our design to reduce the instances of those to get towards a more equitable mean, perhaps.
Thank you, and you make such an excellent point, which I wholeheartedly agree with, which is the fact that that obviously there is an element of inclusiveness, there is an element of representativeness, and there is not just what happens before the outcome, from the setting and establishment of the model objectives all throughout sort of the different phases of the model, which is which makes sort of the AI as a whole system, and I think it starts from sort of the understanding what is the objectives of what we're trying to do, and then looking at the data. And there was one thing that Ziad said that is in relation to the fact that what can happen is that sometimes you may not be able to find the data because of the research criteria that you've set, so, and that may have a sort of a discriminatory impact, and then obviously there has to be the conscious choice to say, I'm actually working on the data set because I want a different outcome. But ultimately wanting a different outcome is a social political decision, because you have to say, these are my values as a company, these are my values as an organization, and I want to produce technology that is able to mirror that. And I wanted to ask Melissa, what is the, what are all these complexities that we've talked about, the different stages of, we need to look at. So how do we navigate all these complexities around, for example, inclusiveness, governance, the company values, and the different trade-offs that even we can have even within a company? What would you say? What is the best way forward?
One of the things I'm just thrilled about in this conversation is we are talking about outcomes, right? Because at the end of the day, I think that's the thing that's the most important for us to focus on when we do try to navigate these various complexities. And we ask ourselves, are the outcomes that are being produced in the work that we're doing, which is partly the model, but it's also the system that the model is going into, are they consistent with our corporate mission to help individuals and businesses and economies to thrive? I am distressed by, but also love the example that Ziad gave about the biased data set, because I think it's not acceptable to say, hey, I selected my data using the right process, but the data set was biased, and so my model was biased, and so the problem is the data and not me. I mean, as practitioners, we have to take responsibility for the outcomes of the systems that our models contribute to. And I think, there's certainly the things like governance that can help with this, but I think at the end of the day, the most important thing is culture, right? I mean, you talked about, you sort of start at the beginning with a normative statement that I think there are certain social outcomes that are better, and I want my system to be promoting those social outcomes. And for instance, one of the things that we did is we went through a process to define certain what we call data values, right? So things like security and control and benefit, fairness, accountability, but basically a North Star for the practitioners in our organization to be using not even just in AI, just anytime we're working with transaction data, to make sure that we're really keeping top of mind not only the process, but at the end of the day, the impact. And one of the implications of this is that, whenever we start in on, for instance, a new product, using data and AI for a new product, we ask ourselves the question, what does the consumer benefit from this? Does the consumer benefit from lower risk of fraud, from greater convenience and online checkout? Do they benefit in terms of increased financial inclusion? But, we have to answer that question and in fairly specific terms. And the product has to pass the test for us to be willing to use data in that way, because to your point, we need to start with a normative perspective on improving the world, and in our mind, in a way that's, again, consistent with our vision of helping individuals, businesses, and economies to thrive.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, I think it's really interesting when you say that, because you're basically saying, I can measure outcomes on the basis of whether they're aligned to the values and the mission that Visa has in the world. And I think that is really good. And I wanted to say to Mark, in relation to this, I just wanted to ask you, how do you navigate the sort of the different trade-offs that may be within a business or private or public sector, whatever it is, in terms of, for example, some situations where, yes, the machines may be doing the right thing, but there isn't really but then, what we would want as a company, it's not aligned to it. I mean,
yeah, I think there's actually a bit of a gap here in perhaps the market of skills and the sets of skills that we talk about that is starting to get filled, but isn't really there yet. So if you look at, if you go and read kind of machine learning papers about fairness, they focus on some quite specific notions of fairness. They talk about essentially bias measured in mathematical form, and lots of different definitions and mitigation techniques for how to deal with bias in models themselves. And that's really, really important. Lots of really good work going on. At the same time, it's probably not the question that someone in a boardroom is trying to ask about what is my organization doing about a big decision-making process. What do we think is fair? Fairness is, it's partly about bias and discrimination. It's also partly about fair process and making sure that people have the ability to challenge decisions that feel wrong. It's also about, probably in many circumstances, decisions not being arbitrary. To pick recruitment as an example, again, a decision is probably unfair if it's purely random. Might not be biased, but it's probably unfair in most circumstances. And all these different notions of fairness and of good outcome kind of come together. They aren't all contradictory. Some of them are, but they're complicated and really context specific. And the bit we haven't quite cracked, I think, collectively, is how to connect that big picture conversation in the boardroom of an organization or in wider society, and how to link that properly into the details of mathematical and data science type conversations about how we define fairness, how we define outcomes, the level of loss functions and data and things. It feels as though there's sort of a missing gap of skill set of a data ethicist or some title a bit like that has a bit of the social science side, a bit of the maths, a bit of the ability to express things clearly in the boardroom. And I think that skill set will be really important in helping people kind of navigate what's the right decision for my organisation, for the groups of people I serve. How do I get that right?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting because there is also the commercial element, isn't there, Mark? I mean, on top of all the skills that you said, probably there's also the business element. So sometimes when there is there's a kind of, a dichotomy between the efficiency and the fairness, then that is very much of that can become really complicated at that stage.
Yeah, I'd actually say one more thing. Like, I think in the UK public sector, we've had a bit of a think about this here and there. I think my observation on that is there are about 4 different groups of people that think they're in charge of this. There are statisticians who think they're in charge because they do stats and they have a lot of really good professional practice in being fair in statistics and being a good statistical practice, and that's quite well developed in the UK government. There are tech people who think they're in charge because it's tech. There are data protection people who think they're in charge because there's data in it. And then really importantly, there are operational people who are actually running big operations, which are starting to adopt some of these techniques. And we're not at the level of people like Vida, we're not automating things, partly because you can't always in the public sector. There are particular laws, particular processes you have to apply in big administrative decisions. But all those groups kind of think that they're the only group who are working on this, and actually working out how you bring them together in a useful way, I don't think is easy.
I agree. Ziad, I wanted to bring you into this, if that's okay, because I mean, the health angle is really interesting because, to an extent, Melissa said I can verify whether it's a good outcome by measuring it against the company values and the company mission. I can say, but in health, this could be more complicated because, and there are so many trade-offs and so many difficulties. So if you get a little bit more practical in terms of inclusiveness and how do you navigate all these problems to make some more practical and pragmatic decisions.
Yeah, so let me first just go back to some of the themes that Melissa and Mark had raised, because I think they're so important. So the process that Melissa described, where there's a fairly high-level group in an organization deciding on what an algorithm does, what a good outcome would be, how we would know, that is so fundamental to the way algorithms should be used. But it's the exception, I think, rather than the rule. So in a lot of the organizations that we've worked with, there's actually no single person or group that's responsible for algorithms. And that's come up a lot in my work because my work is focused on algorithmic bias and where algorithms can go wrong. But it's just as important for where algorithms can go right. Algorithms, as they're used today in organizations, are affecting hundreds of thousands or even millions of patients, of customers in an organization, and yet there's no high-level strategic oversight that is governing what those algorithms are doing, that's holding them accountable to what they're supposed to be doing. It's funny because I trained as a doctor and now I'm doing research, but before medical school, I actually worked at McKinsey, and a lot of that training is now coming back to me as I'm trying to help organizations see how to make algorithms work for them, how to prevent them from going wrong. And I think that to Mark's point around the different cultures, there's a disconnect between the C-suite level people who are setting the strategic objectives of the organization and the people who are in these different IT or data parts of the organization who are making a lot of really important technical decisions without having those reciprocal links to a high level in the organization. And that disconnect is because they don't speak the same language. And so I think increasingly what organizations are going to need, and the people that are going to be in very high demand, are people who are bilingual, who understand where data goes wrong, how bias gets into data, how algorithms can automate that, but also people who see the strategic importance of getting algorithms right for a company's competitive advantage or for a health system's ability to take care of patients. And so, to go back to your question, Ivana, certainly in health, it's very hard to define health. But I would say that, in finance, it's actually quite hard to define consumer financial well-being. In employment, it's very hard to define who is a good employee. And so I actually view these challenges as very common across lots of different industries where we can talk a lot about what good outcomes look like on an abstract level, but how you see those in the data, how you train algorithms to improve them is a really, really common challenge across lots of different sectors.
And I think your point around speaking different languages is really good and important. I have a privacy law background, and we've gone to something very similar, whereby you had the lawyers, and then you had the tech and sometimes, we wouldn't be able to speak to each other. And then now you have this sort of so-called privacy engineering, which is very broad term, which means many different things. But in reality, there is a lot of, that can be put together. And I just wanted to bring Ashley now, because I wanted to really follow up on what Ziad was saying just now. And the question for Ashley is basically, there's something that Ziad said that made me think, and he said at some point, Ziad said, it's difficult to define what a good outcome is. And I thought immediately, I said, well, why don't we ask the people who are going to be impacted the most?
Well, exactly. And, the sad thing which we've seen with, the progression in lots of industries and in technologies, the reality is we will probably find out that things are going wrong or not going well when we really feel the material differences of those. And that's when people aren't necessarily affected in the first instances, but when it's so overt and so extreme that it becomes notable to that mainstream. That disconnect between kind of that leadership and the practitioner level, we see that in lots of ways. You've given an example there of, law firms and even tech regulation. We can see it today, often, even down to social media and all the things that are going on where people involved in making the decisions and making, editorial decisions or whatever it be, aren't necessarily speaking the same language as policymakers or lawmakers. And what we'll see is effectively companies do what they have always done, really, go to that kind of 80-20. Let's build it for those majority use cases. And if someone kind of notices, and if it becomes a really big PR disaster, then we might retrofit it in the end. To an extent, I think that's the route of progression. And really, you kind of see yourself waving here, saying, like, you can see before it hits the fan, but you can kind of know where it's going anyway. And really the question is, how do you stop? And I was thinking, would it be good to have like a set of guiding principles or frameworks? But to that literacy problem, the people who would be in charge of making that are probably some of the most knowledge impoverished people that are going. And on the other end, if you just say, okay, well, we'll manage the symptoms as and when they occur, you'll probably end up having a lot of undesirable outcomes before people actually recognize it and realize it. So that conversation about how do we improve that literacy between those senior leaders and the decision makers who have the strategic priority, which is typically to return the value to shareholders, and actually those folks who are in the decision making where really they probably don't have the ability to really change that objective at the top, and are just really now just trying to ice the cake and kind of knead the dough a little bit and mold it to the best of the bad outcomes that there could be. But what about all those other groups that are outside of this corporate wall that are there saying that this isn't for me, or this isn't going to work, or I can't see this, or you're looking at my health and you're scanning my hand and you're telling me I've got skin cancer, and it's just because I'm black. Like how do we bring those people into that conversation? Because I think that's probably a 3-point literacy that we, that feedback loop really is one that is, I wouldn't even say it's not even absent. It does not exist, and even conceptually, it's pretty far away from anything in reality and what we're seeing.
Yeah, go on.
I was just going to say, if I could connect something that Ashley said, which I think is so spot on with something that Mark said earlier, so that I think actually speaks to, in some ways, the power and the promise of AI in this context, right? So I think Ashley's sort of spot on. Like we have all these places where we have, I would call it missing information, whether it's the AI system because of the data that's being collected, or it's because of historical biases of people that are, looking at skin cancer and aren't used to looking at hands that are not white, right? We have this issue, but one of the things that I think is incredibly powerful when we're evaluating these models and these tools, we can use all of the power of the models and tools. So, for example, in the context of, think of like judgmental underwriting, right? So you cannot take a judgmental underwriter, a person, and say, hey, I want you to evaluate 100,000 applications, and then look at the end at what they did and say, ooh, it seems like, this part was missing and you didn't really get this part and you didn't answer, like the way you made decisions on this population seems sort of inferior. So now I'm going to put you through a training program, and then I'm going to have you evaluate another 100,000 applications and see if you were any different. Like you can't physically do that, but you can with a model. Like you can run those simulations and keep working on the model until you get the level of accuracy and fairness and stability that you're looking for. And that's something that, I mean, whether you start, you may find yourself in a situation where the models are, because of the data, they are not appropriate for making decisions as to who should get access to healthcare or education or a job, but they are appropriate actually for identifying who historically has not gotten access, and therefore where you need to have disproportionate interventions. And so I think Ashley is so spot on in highlighting this issue of the missing voices. They're not missing because we're using AI, right? They've always been missing. But I think AI and the sort of technology that's behind it offer tremendous promise for more quickly, to talk about the speed that Mark talked about before, for more quick, if we use them the right way, for more quickly identifying where we have that missing information and those missing voices, so we can then take the normative step of going and getting them and bringing them into the conversation. So I just thank you.
Yeah, I think that that contrast that you raised to human decision making is really important, because one of the reasons that I find this work that I've been doing on fixing biased algorithms so valuable is because when you fix a biased algorithm, you flip a switch, and overnight that algorithm has changed. In a lot of the settings where we know that humans are biased, whether that's judges or underwriters of loans, or employers, or in all these other settings, it is a lot harder to fix that bias. We don't have a switch that we can flip, and the evidence on training programs and other things is very mixed. And so I actually think that this enterprise of scrutinizing algorithms, finding their errors, but then fixing them, has a huge potential to actually be a tool for justice if we do it right, in a way that we haven't seen before.
Yeah, and to be clear, these people aren't on. It's not AI that's like excluding these things. These people have always been missing from the process. The question is, now we are starting to build a more powerful system. Do we have ways of now including them and checking on what we're doing?
Yeah, sorry, I just wanted to say, and I think it's a really good point. And I'm to my, as you're all speaking, I'm trying to square this discussion in terms of saying, on the one hand, you've got people who think, yes, there is there's a lot of promise. We can use artificial intelligence to fix a lot of the issues that we've got in society right now, especially around sort of discrimination, and that is like that is a little bit disconcerting in my view, because it's a very critical as a discussion. And then there is the other end, which is very much, in terms of, we are facing a big problem at the moment, because we are at risk of hardwiring existing inequalities into systems. So we are basically, as algorithms have more of a policy and editorial and decision-making function, we are basically building decisions around the future based on the data of today, which is not optimal from an equality perspective. So I want to ask you a question. Is it a matter of simply using AI in a different way? So itself, is it a matter of saying we're going to use the tool in a different way? Is it a matter of saying, so I'm trying to square these sort of different views in a more pragmatic way. Is it because I don't want to continue to happen is that we have very different views, and then we don't progress in a very pragmatical way in this debate. Some people say it's impossible to fix an algorithm. There is no technical solution to a problem which is social. How do we get out of all this in a way which is inclusive and beneficial for society?
It's a bit, well, I'll go with this just very briefly, and I was thinking about it. It's a bit like that, the film Spider-Man, where they say with great power comes great responsibility. I think there's a responsibility to start to ask different questions. I think, going back to kind of the examples that Melissa used with the underwriters, we wouldn't ask an underwriter to look at 100,000 cases. What would typically happen is we would just accept them looking at 100, and the system would work more slowly. So we'd still get the bad outcomes, but it might take 10 years to get 100,000 bad outcomes, where now we can get 100,000 bad outcomes in a minute. So the snowball of those bad outcomes really starts to magnify, and that's the great power of the system. But therefore, it's kind of like, we have that responsibility now to say We have so much more analytical power. We can't be asking the same questions that we were before. And typically the question has been, how do we make this quicker? Because speed was always the issue, wasn't it? It's like, well, great, we've got 100,000. Can we do that now? But the question has to move beyond the, can we do this more quickly now? But it actually has to be like, okay, yes, accuracy is starting to become so. It's like, oh, well, actually, gosh, if we let humans do it, we realize like we're not perfect either. So now there's an accuracy question in there, but great. So we've defined a scientific idea of accuracy. But what does that mean for equity and equitable outcomes? And those ethical decisions start to become more and more powerful and more important in this process. So actually, maybe we do need to use the algorithms and AI as much to tell us where things are going wrong, so we can then understand those outcomes and understand where they've come from and how they're getting to be, to use as an analytical tool to make the systems better, rather than seeing the AI and the outcomes of the AI as a solution. Now that takes a lot of thinking. A lot of people have been like, well, how does that marry up with the commercial incentives to do things? Well, we have to marry up that equitable with what we're looking for. And that's ultimately where actually that return to shareholder value has to be conceptualized as well. How do we actually say the most equitable solutions are actually what we're driving towards? Because otherwise we will just keep driving towards systems which maybe produce the most accurate or the most speedy decisions, but with the more powerful, greater, worse consequences.
Sorry, may I ask Mark to come in?
Yeah, I think I agree with almost everything Ashley just said. I think the one concern I have sometimes is the way we use the word, often the word accurate and fair get used almost as opposites in discussions about machine learning. People say that an accuracy fairness trade-off, and you can go, this far along, and if you want to get fairness up here, you need to drop accuracy down a bit. I think mostly it's a great overinterpretation of the maths. I'm not a mathematician by background, but by accuracy we mean something that minimizes a loss function over a particular training set that we had, and by fairness we mean some particular definition of adverse impact across a particular data set. Both of those things are really narrow concepts of accuracy and fairness. If we're making decisions that are not fair, they're probably also inaccurate. If people aren't more or less creditworthy because of the colour of their skin, and our algorithm says they are, it's not only unfair, it's probably also inaccurate in the sort of English language sense. And there's lots of business contexts where that's actually not a good idea, because it's not actually correctly assessing risk. It's not actually correctly inviting in customers who you want. And maybe there's an 80-20 rule problem in that. But I think we do need to somehow find the language that explains that these things aren't a genuine trade-off. But part of being fair is also about actually being accurate and making the right decisions in the first place.
I mean, Mark, I think I really agree with what you're saying, because when you were talking, it really resonated with me, because I was thinking a lot of the discussions that we have, this language of trade-offs, that is, on the one hand, yes, there are trade-offs, that's fine, but on the other hand, we are creating trade-offs that actually they're not there, because as you say, you can't. This is really. Melissa, did you want to come in, Ziad?
I think Ziad had an example. I'd love to hear his example.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, so I had one, this algorithm that I mentioned before. So this family of algorithms that used someone's healthcare costs to measure their healthcare needs in order to find people who needed help with their health. We published this paper a couple of years ago in Science, but before we did, we actually got in touch with the company that made that algorithm, and we alerted them to the problem. And they were incredibly responsive. They replicated our results in their own data, and they assigned a technical team to work with us to come up with better labels to retrain the algorithm, so that it was finding people who needed help with their health, not just people who cost a lot of money. And so when we did that, we actually did two things. One is we dramatically reduced the amount of bias in that revised algorithm. By one metric, it was reduced by 84%. But the other thing that happened was that algorithm was far more in line with the original purpose of the algorithm, which is finding people who needed help so that we can prevent exacerbations of chronic conditions, keep them out of the emergency room, keep them out of the hospital. So I completely agree with you, Mark, that sometimes there actually is not a trade-off. Sometimes we can realign algorithms with their strategic purposes, which are often about targeting resources to people who need them. And when we do that better, not only do we increase equity, we increase the efficiency of the algorithm as well. So I couldn't agree more. And I think that, in our follow-on work, we got a lot of publicity for that original study, and we turned that publicity into collaborations with a number of other health systems and insurers and tech companies. And we found similar patterns in lots of other settings where there's a lot of algorithmic bias in a lot of settings, but in a lot of cases that can be fixed, and that revised algorithm is both more efficient and also more equitable.
I mean, it's really interesting, and I'd like to push back, if I may, because and I want to ask you a question. So, aren't you a little bit scared, all of you, by the concept of the idea that an algorithm can be fixed without thinking of how the actual machine is going to be used? So the reason why I'm saying this is because one of the things that I'm concerned a lot over recent times is sort of facial recognition, right? And everybody says facial recognition is biased. And I'm like, well, yes, it is, but that's not the only point, because even if we created a perfect facial recognition system that does not make any mistake, that doesn't eliminate the problem that it could be used to wrap surveillance around some people rather than others. The reason why I'm saying this is because how do we reconcile the fact that there is the technical element, that we need to look after at the different stages, and as you said, the data, the inclusiveness, representativeness, and all of that, and having the courage to do so, with the actual use of the product. Yes, go on.
Yeah, no, I think you ask a great question, which is, it's back to Ashley's point about with great power comes great responsibility, right? So if you create an incredibly accurate system, aren't you worried then about how that accurate system might be used? And I guess the way that I reconcile this is I ask myself, is the future going to be better than the past, right? So if there's a really accurate facial recognition system, right, and it causes surveillance of a particular group, does that lead to more bias than in the US, at least, spectacular level of racial profiling that happens right now, right? Or less? Because if it's less, that's better, right? And I would like to get to a place where all of the systems were perfectly accurate and perfectly fair. But until we get to that point, at a minimum, I'd like to make sure the systems are used to move us in that general direction. And I think sometimes we get ourselves in a little bit of a pickle, because we try to measure AI systems because they can be fixed and because you can flip switches. And in some cases, because of the language gaps where the people making the decisions don't totally understand what's going on in the system. So it's kind of like magic to them. We end up with these sort of situations where people compare the AI system to a version of perfect as opposed to the reality of today. And I think it's really important. This is, we go back to what we talked about at the beginning. We're measuring versus outcomes, and we have to consider versus the outcomes that we have today. And are these tools and systems making us better than we are today?
Yeah, I mean that's really good. And I'm so pleased that to see that there is this thinking of Visa. It's really good. It's really testament to your approach and the work that you're doing in this. It's really good. Did you have any comments on this, Mark, Ashley, Ziad?
I mean, I think about kind of what Melissa shared, but then I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm really scared. Because I think about things, I'm like, gosh, is it going to be better? I can only see things getting worse. And I'm like, my track record is the amount of bad things that I see come out. Okay, let me not scare myself. There are lots of good things that happen in technology, and there are lots of amazing things that we're able to do. Even this today is a testament to that, yeah? And I'm infused about the prospect of technology, which is why I love this industry, which is why I never leave it and why I work here. However, I think the magnitude of the consequences of getting things wrong is starting to increase. And when I see things go badly, maybe, say it was a filter on social media which has gone badly because maybe the design process wasn't as great. That has maybe on the magnitude of things, maybe a smaller impact. And, that's not to tell people about, underestimate, say, the mental health aspects of those things going wrong. But when it comes to, like housing and credit scores and criminal justice and policing and profiling, I'm like, oh my gosh, we might end up unwittingly have people from all different walks of life in whatever situation having lower quality of life as a result of this wonderful thing called technology. And my problem is I don't see the pace of this kind of discussion keeping up with the pace of the innovation of stuff that I see come out every time I look at TechCrunch or Wired. and that's what bothers me, basically, because for every new product I see, I'm thinking, like, how much has really been going on in that background? And maybe there's one conversation, or maybe it's a tick box. Yeah, we got this thing, we followed our checklist, but how much conversation is really going into that? And I know lots of the big companies, Visa, I'm sure as well, are have teams and people dedicated to this, but they're not the only ones who are innovating. And I know there are lots of companies that don't. And that's what worries me, because especially with this growth of that venture capital ecosystem too, we are seeing blitz funding going into things which are just not well considered in the same way that they could be. And we start to see the impact of that. Take Clubhouse as the app, and there's all the accessibility issues that come with that. Now, that might have fewer social consequences than other things, but there's so many examples where we can say, oh, that came out, but it doesn't work for disabled people. Like, that's something we should just accept. Well, we don't accept that, if you get into a building these days, it's not allowed to work for disabled people. So why do we accept it when we're now thinking about the new ways to access information or technology? So that's what I'm worried about. So I don't know. Like, just got to flip a coin.
Yeah, Mark, how worried are you? In 30 seconds.
So I think I'm probably less worried. I think one of the really important bits to this that I think doesn't get enough attention is how we're actually using these tools. And they're called tools, and I think the tool analogy is actually quite helpful. If we give somebody a hammer, it's a really dangerous thing. It can cause a lot of harm. And if you give someone a hammer in a professional context, you train them to use it sensibly, you pay some attention to how they're using it, you report accidents when they go wrong, all those sorts of things. That feels to me like the bit that we need to pay more attention to. We need to make sure that users do understand what they've got. Where there are decision-making processes, you mentioned, like criminal justice, there's never, I hope, going to be a situation where algorithms are making decisions in isolation about who should be arrested. That would be a horrible place to be. They're tools that are going to be used by police officers or by whoever else. If that's happening, we need to make really, really sure that the people using it understand the limitations. They understand, when things are certain, which they almost never are, when things are not certain, and feel genuinely empowered to challenge and question and all those things. And that, I think, is variably successful in different places, but should be a huge focus of some of the conversation around this.
Yeah, Ziad, I just wanted to, some sort of conclusive remarks for you. I do have a question for you following what Mark said, one of my naughty questions. And the questions I have for you is the following, is, so Mark said, yes, I mean, if you give somebody a hammer, that the hammer can do for good and can do the bad, depends on what you use it for. Well, Mark, I'm not sure I agree with that. And the reason why I'm saying this is because I think when it comes to an artificial intelligence product, I think there are some things that it's not really a hammer, is it? Because it's got some dependent, some affordances. They're so big, then I think are much different from a hammer. I think we're talking about something which has some very, very strong transformative power within it.
People don't use them as tools. They see them as a panacea to solving their problems.
Yes, that's a problem. Yes, I agree. So, Mark, maybe we can talk about this from another time with a drink. But I do think really that there are the issue of affordances within a product, and the fact that it's got a techno but also social element into it. I think it makes it different from a hammer.
And I think I don't disagree at all entirely. I think the metaphor could be stretched so far. I think in the level of individual organisations and kind of how you roll things out in individual organisations is not a bad metaphor. When you get to big social media platforms and like products that are deployed in loads of places, it probably falls down.
But just wanted to ask you, it's so. Yes, how worried are you? But how optimistic as well are you with regards to that? And is there anything else you want to share with us?
Yeah, I think to tie together Ashley's great point with Mark's, I think that and your question about the hammer, I think it's really, really important to articulate exactly what the algorithm is supposed to do, to tie that into the decision that it's being used to inform, and to make sure that we're informed about that, not just so we can use it so that we know what the hammer is, but also so that regulators can enforce those kinds of things. In a lot of my work, we've found these clear instances of market failures where the company that made the algorithm, the organizations that purchased the algorithm, the consumers that were affected by it were not at all aware of the huge problems in the algorithm. So there's a clear role for regulation here, but that depends on articulating what the target for regulation is. What is the thing we want the algorithm to do, and how do we hold it accountable?
Melissa, one final remark from you, please.
Sorry. Yes. I just think that the back to your hammer analogy. I think this technology has the potential to be as transformative as moving from steam to electricity or the introduction of the integrated circuit. So I'm buying what you're selling on. It's more powerful than a hammer. But if you think about the opportunity to use something that transformative for actually accelerating the improvement in social outcomes that I think all of us want. I don't know. I'm just incredibly optimistic about that future, and it's on us. It's on us to make sure that that's where we end up.
And we're definitely. I mean, I feel definitely optimistic knowing that Visa's got someone like you at the helm of it, because I think it's a fantastic approach that you have to all this. Thank you.